Mod 4, Lesson 1, Conflict in the Colonies. If you live in the New England colonies in the 1700s, recently, British officials have placed new taxes on tea, your favorite beverage. You've never been very interested in politics, but you're beginning to think that people far across the ocean in Britain shouldn't be able to tell you what to do. Some of your friends have joined a group that refuses to buy British tea. Would you give up your favorite drink to join the boycott? Great Britain raises taxes. Great Britain had won the French and Indian War, but Parliament still had to pay for it. The British continued to keep a standing or permanent army in North America to protect the colonists against Indian attacks. To help pay for this army, Prime Minister George Grenville asked Parliament to tax the colonists. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, which set duties on molasses and sugar imported by colonists. This was the first act passed specifically to raise money in the colonies. British officials also tried harder to arrest smugglers. Colonial merchants were required to list all the trade goods they carried aboard their ships. These lists had to be approved before ships could leave colonial ports. This made it difficult for traders to avoid paying duties. The British Navy also began to stop and search ships for smuggled goods. Parliament also changed the colony's legal system by giving greater powers to the Vice Admiralty courts. These courts had no juries, and the judges treated suspected smugglers as guilty until proven innocent. In regular British courts, accused persons were treated as innocent until proven guilty. Taxation without representation. Parliament's actions upset many colonists who had grown used to being independent and governing themselves. The Parliament's longtime practice of salutary neglect or not enforcing most laws governing the colonies had fostered individualism among the colonists. The government's previous hands-off approach made these actions seem even harsher to the colonists. The rising merchant class thought the taxes were unfair and hurt business. Many believed that Great Britain had no right to tax the colonies at all without popular consent. James Otis, a colonial lawyer, argued that the power of the Crown and Parliament was limited. Otis said they could not take from any man any part of his property without his consent in person or by representation. Colonial assemblies had little influence on Parliament's decisions. In addition, the colonists had no direct representatives in Parliament. The colonists were subjects of the Crown instead of citizens of England. At a Boston town meeting in May 1764, local leader Samuel Adams agreed with Otis. He believed that Parliament could not tax the colonists without their permission. The ideas of Otis and Adams were summed up in the slogan, "No taxation without representation," which spread throughout the colonies. Adams helped found the Committees of Correspondence. Each committee got in touch with other towns and colonies. Its members shared ideas and information about the new British laws and ways to challenge them. A popular method of protest was the boycott, in which people refused to buy British goods. The first colonial boycott started in New York in 1765. It soon spread to other colonies. Colonists hoped that their efforts would hurt the British economy and might convince Parliament to end the new taxes. Stamp Act. The British government continued to search for new ways to tax the American colonies, further angering many colonists. For example, Prime Minister Grenville proposed the Stamp Act of 1765. This act required colonists to pay for an official stamp or seal when they bought paper items. The tax had to be paid on legal documents, licenses, newspapers, pamphlets, and even playing cards. Colonists who refused to buy stamps could be fined or sent to jail. Grenville did not expect this tax to spark protest. After all, in Britain, people already paid similar taxes, but colonists saw it differently. The Stamp Act was Parliament's first attempt to raise money by taxing the colonists directly, rather than by taxing imported goods. Mercy Otis Warren, a writer in the Massachusetts colony, disagreed with the new tax. She began writing plays that accused British leaders of being greedy. Protests against the Stamp Act began almost immediately. Colonists formed a secret society called the Sons of Liberty. Samuel Adams helped organize the group in Boston. This group sometimes used violence to frighten tax collectors. Many colonial courts shut down because people refused to buy the stamps required for legal documents. Businesses openly ignored the law by refusing to buy stamps. In May 1765, a Virginia lawyer named Patrick Henry presented a series of resolutions to the Virginia House of Burgesses. These resolutions stated that the Stamp Act violated colonist rights. In addition to taxation without representation, the Stamp Act denied the accused a trial by jury. Henry's speech in support of the resolutions convinced the Assembly to support some of his ideas. Repealing the Stamp Act. In Boston, the members of the Massachusetts legislature called for a Stamp Act Congress. In October 1765, delegates from 9 colonies met in New York. They issued a declaration that the Stamp Act was a violation of their rights and liberties. Pressure on Parliament to repeal or do away with the Stamp Act grew quickly. A group of London merchants complained that their trade suffered from the colonial boycott. Parliament repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. Members of Parliament were upset that colonists had challenged their authority. Thus, Parliament issued the Declaratory Act, which stated that Parliament had the power to make laws for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. The Declaratory Act further worried the colonists. The act stripped away much of their independence. The Townshend Acts. In June 1767, Parliament passed the Townshend Acts. These acts placed duties on glass, lead, paint, paper, and tea. To enforce the Townshend Acts, British officials used writs of assistance. These allowed tax collectors to search for smuggled goods. Colonists hated the new laws because they took power away from colonial governments. The colonists responded to the Townshend Acts by once again boycotting many British goods. Women called themselves the Daughters of Liberty supported the boycott. In February 1768, Samuel Adams wrote a letter arguing that the laws violated the legal rights of the colonists. The Massachusetts legislature sent the letter to other colonies' legislatures, who voted to join the protests. At the same time, tax collectors in Massachusetts seized the ship Liberty on suspicion of smuggling. This action angered the ship's owner and the Sons of Liberty. They attacked the houses of customs officials in protest. In response, the governor broke up the Massachusetts legislature. He also asked troops to restore order. British soldiers arrived in Boston in October 1768. Boston Massacre. Many Bostonians saw the presence of British troops as a threat by the British government against its critics in Massachusetts. Some colonists agreed with Samuel Adams, who said, "I look upon British soldiers as foreign enemies." The soldiers knew that they were not welcome. Both sides resented each other, and name-calling, arguments, and fights between Bostonians and the soldiers were common. The tension exploded on March 5, 1770. A lone British soldier standing guard had an argument with a colonist and struck him. A crowd gathered around the soldier, throwing snowballs and shouting insults. Soon, a small number of troops arrived. The crowd grew louder and angrier by the moment. Some yelled, "Come on, you rascals! Fire if you dare!" Suddenly, the soldiers fired into the crowd, instantly killing 3 men, including African-American sailor Crispus Attucks. Attucks is the best remembered casualty of the incident. 2 others died within a few days. Samuel Adams and other protesters quickly spread the story of the shootings. They used it as a propaganda, a story giving only one side in an argument against the British. Colonists called the shootings the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere created an elaborate color print titled "The Bloody Massacre Perpetrated in King Street." The soldiers and their officers, Thomas Preston, were charged with murder. 2 Boston lawyers, Josiah Quincy and John Adams, Samuel Adams' cousin, agreed to defend the soldiers. The British soldiers claimed that they acted in self-defense. Quincy and Adams argued this point in the trial. The Boston jury agreed, finding Preston and 6 soldiers not guilty. 2 soldiers were convicted of killing people in the crowd by accident. These men were branded on the hand and released. The trial helped calm people down, but many were still angry at the British. The Boston Tea Party. To reduce tensions in the colonies, Parliament repealed almost all of the Townshend Acts. However, it kept the tax on tea. British officials knew that the colonial demand for tea was high despite the boycott. But colonial merchants were smuggling most of this imported tea and paying no duty on it. The British East India Company offered Parliament a solution. The company had huge amounts of tea but was not allowed to sell it directly to the colonists. If the company could sell directly to the colonists, it could charge low prices and still make money. Cheaper tea might encourage colonists to stop smuggling. Less smuggling would result in more tax money. Parliament agreed and passed the Tea Act in 1773, which allowed the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonists. Many colonial merchants and smugglers feared that the British East India Company's cheap tea would put them out of business. 3 ships loaded with tea from British East India Company arrived in 1773. Members of the Sons of Liberty demanded that the ships leave, but the governor of Massachusetts would not let the ships leave without paying the duty. Unsure of what to do, the captains waited in the harbor. On the night of December 16, 1773, colonists disguised as Native Americans sneaked onto the 3 tea-filled ships and dumped over 340 tea chests into Boston Harbor. This event became known as the Boston Tea Party. Soon the streets echoed the shouts of Boston Harbor is a teapot tonight. I'm on page 112. The Intolerable Acts. Lord North, the new British Prime Minister, was furious when he heard the news. Parliament decided to punish Boston. In the spring of 1774, it passed the Coercive Acts. Colonists called these laws the Intolerable Acts. The acts had several effects. Number 1, Boston Harbor was closed until Boston paid for the ruined tea. Number 2, Massachusetts charter was canceled. The governor decided if and when the legislature could meet. Number 3, royal officials accused of crimes were sent to Britain for trial. This let them face a friendlier judge and jury. 4, a new quartering act required colonists to house British soldiers. 5, the Quebec Act gave a large amount of land to the colony of Quebec. 6, General Thomas Gage became the new governor of Massachusetts. The British hoped that these steps would bring back order in the colonies. Instead, they simply increased people's anger at Britain. Summary and preview. In this lesson, you learned about the increasing dissatisfaction between the colonists and Great Britain. In the next lesson, you'll learn about the events that started the American Revolution.